Here we are for part 2 of chapter 4. Confirmation and disconfirmation through verbal messages. So we're going to start here by defining what those two words mean. Disconfirmation is ignoring another person's feelings and communication that comes from them. Key word there is ignoring. This is not the same as rejecting. It's just a lack of acknowledgement of the importance of that person or that they even exist sometimes. So that's disconfirmation. And it leads to low self-esteem in the person that is the target of disconfirmation. Confirmation, on the other hand, is validating the other person's feelings and indicating acceptance toward them, leads to gaining self-esteem. So this is the opposite of ignoring. It's actually paying attention to someone. In this part of the chapter, there's a whole host of things that they talk about that lead to disconfirmation. And so in order to lead us to confirming others, we want to avoid linguistic behaviors such as racism. So when it comes to racism, remember that race is a social construct. It is something that we've all come up with. If you want to look at different sociological terms, anthropological terms, and so on and so forth, you'll find that everyone has different definitions of what race is. Ethnicity is probably a more important consideration for us to make whenever we see how people act and behave differently. Race has very little bearing on the matter, so we need to put that out of our minds. So there are behaviors to avoid, obviously derogatory terms aimed at races. Maintaining and using stereotypes. Maintaining just means through the continued use, we keep them around. Referencing race when it's irrelevant. In other words, referring to most likely someone's color before whatever it is they do for a living. And attributing problems a person might have or might be a part of to their race. We have what's called ageism. Ageism is whenever someone is prejudiced toward someone because of their age, be it because they're way too young or way too old or something along those lines. Typically, we see it targeted toward elders. So behaviors to avoid here: avoid talking down to older people. Don't expect that they are less apt to be able to understand you just because they may have a few years on you. Don't insist on refreshing someone's memory all the time. Do so only when asked. Implying that romantic relationships are no longer important because the physical frame may be wearing out as we get older. Doesn't mean that there's still not a desire for romantic relationships. Speaking in an abnormally high manner, whether that's high volume or speaking with a higher tone, like we would to a child. Sometimes people do that because it sounds more simple, because it's the way we speak to children. Don't do that with your elders. It's disrespectful. And then sometimes people just altogether avoid conversing with older people. A lot of times they feel like it could be awkward, maybe if they have memory problems or something like that. All stereotypes that may be associated with having many years behind them. And you have heterosexism. Heterosexism is tied with homophobia. Behaviors to avoid here: offensive non-verbal mannerisms. In other words, displaying shock at the sight of a homosexual couple. implying that there is a look to being homosexual. That would be considered a negative behavior there, so something to avoid. Assuming that all gay men and lesbians think the same way. It would be the same discretion to think that all heterosexual people think the same way. Again, avoid stereotyping, avoid attributing things to someone's sexuality that have no bearing there. Acknowledge that relationship milestones are just as important to homosexual couples as heterosexual couples. Pardon me. And so on. Then we have sexism, which is where someone is prejudiced against based on their biological sex. Behavior to avoid here, because it is all over our language, it's the use of man generically. So instead of saying chairman, you might say chairperson. Perfectly acceptable substitution. Also, the assumption that sex roles or gender roles are set in stereotypes, that a man goes to work and brings home the bacon, whereas a woman needs to stay home and cook and clean. Those should be things that are put behind us. Just statistically speaking, those are no longer accurate. Essentially, all these things we've discussed are cultural identifiers on some level. Someone's race, ethnicity, or nationality does impact the way they communicate, and we should communicate appropriately. We should learn about those cultures to communicate clearly. Age does impact the way that we communicate because of something called generational identity. It impacts what's important to us and what's not. Affectional orientation, we choose to like or to love, those things do impact the way we communicate with others. Sex and gender also communicate or impact the way we communicate with others and what's important to us. So go through this section of the textbook. There's a lot of additional information here. I'm just going to cover it very briefly, as I have. Look through these things. Call people what they want to be called. Be kind to others. And make sure that you do not display an arrogant or ignorant attitude.